Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Craig Davis, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for a very special program, one of many we present on an ongoing basis and on a wide variety of topics. At this time, I would ask that you please turn off all noise-making electronic devices. Today, and for the first time, we're very pleased to co-host a program in partnership with the National Park Service as part of their Abraham Lincoln's Journey Home series. Illinois is known as the land of Lincoln, and Chicago played a major role in Lincoln's life and career. The Chicago Public Library is honored to participate in these commemorative programs marking the 150th anniversary of President Lincoln's funeral. To formally open today's program, please join me in welcoming Duey Kol and Vanessa Torres, Park Rangers with the National Park Service.
Good afternoon. My name is Vanessa Torres. I'm a park ranger at Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area in Los Angeles, California.
Good afternoon. My name is Duey Kol. I'm a park ranger based out of Washington, D.C.
We are honored to participate in the National Park Service's commemoration of the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's funeral. On behalf of the National Park Service, we would like to thank all those who made this event possible. We are honored to be with you here today as we pause to consider this crucial moment in our nation's history. On April 14, 1861, an American flag was lowered over a fort named Sumter in a harbor named Charleston. Many Americans look upon that event as the marking of the beginning of the American Civil War. 4 years later to that day, that same American flag was raised over that same fort. Many Americans view this as the end of the American Civil War. Yet there was one shot left to be fired. That evening in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, was shot. The following morning, across the street in Peterson's house at 7:22 a.m., he passed away. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stated, "Now he belongs to the ages."
In May and April of 1865, 150 years ago this month, a train carried Lincoln's remains from our nation's capital of Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, to their final resting place. The prairie lawyer from Illinois was going home. All the major cities along the route held funerals for him. If you could imagine, thousands of Americans, families, veterans, soldiers, men, women, and children of all races, they all came to visit Lincoln to pay their last final respect. As the Americans attended the funerals, you can well imagine there were many questions. What would we do now? What will America become? What should America become? What would he want us to do? What would he want America to become?
A fundamental question was at stake. In 1865, 4 million African-American men, women, and children were now free. Should they become full citizens? Should they have the right to vote and hold political office? As we will learn, Lincoln was not silent on these questions. With a nod to the founding generation, Lincoln wrote in 1863 that this nation had been conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Would Reconstruction lead to the fulfillment of the nation's founding ideals of freedom and equality? Would there be a new birth of freedom? Americans did not know how it would turn out, just as we do not know what will happen tomorrow. Our ancestors a century and a half ago did know one thing, however, that things would be different. But no one knew what that change would be, what that story would be.
My story began 40 years ago when my parents survived genocide in Cambodia. Separated from their families as young adults, forced into slave labor, working 16 hours a day, it was an awful civil war. In less than 4 years, 2 million people lost their lives out of a country of 7 million. My parents, they were determined to have their freedom, even at the cost of death. Not knowing where they would end up, they courageously fled Cambodia to the refugee camps in Thailand, where my sister and I were born. And we are among the lucky one. In less than 3 years, we were sponsored to Boston, Massachusetts, where we now live, chasing the American dream, like many immigrants before us. And even though we grew up really poor and didn't speak English initially. Through hard work and education, we made it.
My story begins just a little over 100 years ago when my great-great-grandparents immigrated to Texas from Mexico and Spain. With 2 dimes in their pocket, they worked their fingers to the bone as migrant workers, picking vegetables and fruit. It is because of their hard work and sacrifice that I am able to stand before you here today. It is our privilege and honor on the 150th anniversary of the end of the American Civil War to introduce to you Abraham Lincoln. Listen to what he has to say. What you will hear are taken from Lincoln's actual words, words that convey his hope for his country, for his story, and for our story. Ladies and gentlemen, Abraham Lincoln.
Good day, my friends. Ladies, I am particularly pleased to have this opportunity to be with you today and to say a few things regarding the future. Oh my, I am more than gratified to be able to say that we can meet together this day, not in sorrow any longer, but with gladness of heart. Surely the evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond, the surrender of the principal insurgent armies, has given all of us hope. My friends, we can finally enjoy a righteous and a speedy peace. The joyous expression can hardly any longer be restrained. It was nearly a full week before it finally penetrated to my own soul. I remember the evening Mrs. Lincoln and I were driving to the theater on the 14th of April, and it dawned upon me that every other time I was on my way, it was to relieve myself of the terrible, continuous, unrelenting burden of this war. And that now, for the first time, I could go with no burden of war. So, but in the midst of all the rejoicing, of course, he from whom all blessings flow must never be forgotten. I actually have already written a call for national thanksgiving, and it will be duly promulgated upon my return to Washington. And of course, we cannot forget those whose harder part has given us cause for all of this. You know, I actually myself was very near the front. I had the great pleasure of transmitting much of the recent good news to the people just before the surrender. But, my friends, no part of the honor, either for plan or execution, belongs to me. It goes to General Grant, his brave men, his skillful officers. It is to them it all belongs. I frankly think it would be hard to say whether anything has been more bravely or well done than at Petersburg, Gettysburg, Murfreesboro, many fields of lesser note. And of course, we cannot forget Uncle Sam's webbed feet. I'll tell you, not only out on the open sea or the broad bay, but at all the watery margins, down the rapid river, up the narrow muddy bayou, wherever the ground was even a little damp. Well, I wish to tender my thanks to all for this great union, for the principle that it lives by. I wish to tender my thanks to all. So now, perhaps on this occasion I can finally say some things, if I might be permitted, regarding my own hopes and expectations for the future. Once the matters of war and reconstruction have been safely secured, and I do suppose that if any of you have questions after my brief remarks that you wish to tender, I will do my best to offer an answer as well as I might. I find it curious. over these past 4 years in a time of national peril, I have so frequently felt that I would not outlast the war myself. That once this war had concluded, that my work would be done. And yet, here I am, a re-election, a re-inauguration safely behind me. I suppose now I can breathe a sigh of relief. But I do want to say that I view this call to a second term as in no way complimentary to myself, but rather as a simple judgment made by the American people who have apparently concluded that I, having passed through 4 arduous years, may be better qualified than somebody else less hardly schooled in these matters. And so with this in view, and with an assured hope in the continued ever-watchful providence of our beneficent Father, who has brought us safely to these peaceful shores now, and with a renewed sense of gratitude to the American people who have replaced their trust in me for another 4 years, I accept their renewed confidence, even with its yet onerous and perplexing difficulties. Who of us would have imagined, my friends, 4 years ago that we would have been carried through this? Of course, all eyes were fixed upon the possibility of a civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. In fact, while my first inaugural address was being delivered in Washington City, devoted altogether to saving this union without any war, there were already insurgent agents operating in the city, devoted altogether to destroying the union without any war. They simply divide effects by negotiation, I expect. But both parties deprecated war. And yet, one would rather make war than let this nation survive. And the other would accept war rather than let it pass. And the war came. Approximately 1/8 of our entire population were colored slaves at that time, and of course not distributed throughout the entirety of the nation, but located primarily in the southern part of it. And all of us knew that somehow these slaves constituted a peculiar and a powerful interest, that to strengthen and perpetuate and extend this interest was the cause for which these insurgents would rend the Union. Well, this government claimed no right other than to simply restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for this war, for the magnitude or the duration which it obtained. Neither supposed that the very cause of the conflict would cease with, even before the conflict itself ceased. Each looked for an easier triumph, a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible, prayed to the same God, and each invoked his aid against the other. Now, it may seem strange to us that any man would dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, lest we also be judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The scriptures tell us, woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe unto that man by whom the offense cometh. My friends, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs have come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove. And that he gave to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due unto those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which believers in a living God have always ascribed to him? Fondly have we hoped, and fervently have we prayed that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. And yet, if God had willed that it continue until all of the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years should have been sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash should have been repaid by another drawn by the sword, nevertheless, it would be said, as was said some 3,000 years ago, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Now, in saying all of these things, I do not wish to be understood as having any particular prejudice against Southern people. I frankly think they are just what we would have been had we been born in their circumstances. You know, if slavery had already existed among us, we would not have just instantly gotten rid of it either. And if it had not existed amongst them, I don't think they would have introduced it. I've always believed this is people, South as well as North. Oh, doubtless there were people on both sides that never would own a slave under any circumstances. And I think there are still those among us who would gladly see it reintroduced if they could but find means. But so far as I am concerned, I'll repeat a declaration I made nearly 2 years ago now, before the re-election, that while I remain in my present position, I do not intend to retract or modify the proclamation of emancipation, nor shall I be returning to slavery any of the persons who have been freed by the terms of that document. Now, if the people should, by whatever mode or means, make it an executive duty to re-enslave those people, I'm afraid some other, not myself, will have to become their instrument to perform that. And you know, in saying these things, I am not intending any compliment to my own wisdom or sagacity. I do not claim to have control of events. I will confess plainly now, events have controlled me. Here we are, at the end of this struggle. This nation's condition is not what either party or any man alone devised or expected. God alone can claim it. So, with high hope for the future, I do not wish to make any prediction respecting it. There actually are 3 or 4 small things that I do wish to speak about before I conclude. I think the most noteworthy, as you recall, the passage through Congress last January of a constitutional amendment for the abolishment of slavery throughout the several United States. Oh, it is a laudatory matter, worthy of congratulations to the people, to you, my friends, for this noble act of Congress. And yet, there remains a task for us to perform as well, and that is, of course, the ratification of this amendment throughout 27 of the now reunited 36 states of America. And I believe that the people of this country will perform this matter soon and with alacrity. I am most grateful. It is, in fact, a matter worthy of renewed congratulations to you, the people, to the whole world, for so great a moral victory. Now, I'd be the first to admit, the proclamation of emancipation had many attendant evils. There were those who claimed from the very beginning that it had questionable legal authority. There were those who questioned its applicability to those slaves who had not had opportunity or perhaps were not willing to take the risk to flee their bonds during the late war. Or application to the children of those slaves here who have fled. But my friends, this amendment is the king's cure once it achieves its final fulfillment. And so, we look now to the future with all the recent successes. Of course, the reinauguration of the National Authority Reconstruction, which frankly had a large share of my thought right from the very beginning, is pressed much more closely upon us. Oh, it is fraught with difficulties. And I intend to proceed with due precaution. A few little matters respecting it. It has come to my attention repeatedly that I am much censured for the part I have taken in my seeking to set up and sustain the new loyal state government of Louisiana. Now, my friends, I think that all would have found it much more acceptable if the amount of the constituency, so to speak, could have summed to some 50,000 or 40 or even 20,000. But we did obtain 12. It would have been a matter more acceptable to many, including myself, if the colored man could have obtained the elective franchise, the vote. I frankly would have been much gratified if it could have been conferred upon him immediately. Those who were educated, those who served in the military, in the Army and Navy during the late war. Now, I frankly find it difficult to even conceive of how people claiming to subscribe to Christianity, or even people with the ordinary concept of right and wrong, could differ on this point. To read in the sacred scripture as the word of God, as ye would that men should do unto you, do ye also unto them. And then to deny to an entire race of people what no man would desire for himself, to be is an insult to God and to his church. But I must forbear, as I said earlier, let us judge not, lest we also be judged. However, the question of Louisiana, as it has been presented, seems to simply be, is it all that is desirable? I frankly think it would be better framed thus. Would it be wiser to take it as it is, or to reject it and disperse it? Now, my friends, if we do that, we do our best to discourage the 12,000 that we do have, who are now subscribed to a loyal work such as we have done. We say to the white man of Louisiana, you were worthless. You were worse than worthless, and we will not help you, nor will we be helped by you. And to the colored men we say, this cup of liberty which your former masters have just held to your lips, we now dash from your lips, and leave it to you as to whether you may gather the scattered contents in whatever way or time you might. But if we refuse to so conclude, the converse of all of that is true. We inspire, we energize 12,000 to the ready task. We move them to proselytize for our common cause, to feed, to water, to grow, and bring it to maturity. And the black man, thus seeing all assembled in his behalf, will find a new daring, a new courage. Granted, he has not obtained yet the franchise, the vote. Will he obtain it sooner by backing over what we have thus accomplished and destroying this goodly work, or by standing fast where we are and looking to the future? I think the latter. Now, this particular case in Louisiana is in many semblances true in the other several states. However, their case is nearly daily changing, and sometimes sudden changes are wrought upon them. The whole case, withal, is new to every one of us. Now, I am convinced that to be forced into an exclusive, inflexible plan regarding all of the states would surely become an entanglement to us, maybe only in the next few days. Now, obviously, important principles may and must be inflexible. But the present situation, as this phrase goes, may require some announcement to the Southern people. And I actually am considering such an announcement and will, in fact, make it once I am convinced that it is fit and proper. Now, there's one other situation I would like to address. As you may have read in the last session of Congress, well, in my last annual message, I brought up the fact that the Department of Indian Affairs needs be reformed. My friends, if you had perspective over these matters as I have obtained in these last few years, you would agree with me that it is a piece of wickedness. And as we fear God, we must insist in its reformation. And I have concluded once matters of war and reconstruction are safely put aside securely, I intend to pursue justice for the Indian, both to his and to my own satisfaction. And I have reiterated those sentiments to our friends in Congress. Now, of course, with the cessation of hostilities, the original animation and energy and enterprise of our prosperous country is put back into a new animation which we have hitherto hardly ever seen. The great enterprise, which has been undertaken years ago of connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific states with a railway and a telegraph line, has been now renewed with an assurance of success. As you may have read, the road extending westward now 100 miles from Omaha City out in Nebraska is making great progress. And in the far west, it is originating in Sacramento, California, and has progressed into Nevada many, many miles to the great bend of the Truckee River. On the other hand, the telegraph line between the Atlantic and the Pacific has met with national approbation, but in the last session of Congress, a new branch was approved, extending over the Bering Straits throughout and across Asiatic Russia. An American company now has undertaken to see it conducted through the most favorable circumstances, not only with the approval and support of this government, but with that of Russia and Great Britain. And in fact, some of the South American states have recently sent their high appreciation and readiness to cooperate in constructing a world-encircling means of electric communication. Now, From the eastern seaboard, of course, before the war, the transatlantic cable with Great Britain was severed, but there is now a very successful design to reunite it, and we can expect not only an early renewal of that communication, but full expectation of its early accomplishment. Lastly, the financial affairs of this government have been conducted over these past 4 years with astounding success under the very capable leadership of former Secretary of Chase and now Mr. Fessenden. Our brand new financial system, inaugurated under the necessity of war, has been met not only with the approbation of the capitalists among us, but with common people like you and I as well. And so, those are my expectations and hopes. But what will, in fact, these next 4 years bring? No man knows. I frankly did not expect it to be reelected. I had not expected it at all. Such a thing has not occurred since the days of General Jackson, 30 years or more. But you know something? I do give thanks to God for the approval of the people, as witnessed by my reelection, and their continued support of the principle of liberty. You see, my friends, I still believe that that sentiment in our Charter of Liberty that proclaims we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, remains the great fundamental principle upon which all of our future hopes and liberties rest. I don't think I ever had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I love the sentiments of those old-time men. This was their majestic interpretation of the economy of the universe. And it was a lofty, a wise, a noble understanding of the justice of the Creator to His creatures, to all of His creatures, my friends, to the whole great family of man. In their enlightened belief, nothing stamped with that divine image was sent into this world merely to be trodden on or brutalized by its own fellows. And you see, they grasped not just the race of men then living, they reached forward to seize upon the farthest posterity. They erected a beacon to guide their children and their children's children, the countless myriads who would inhabit this nation in future generations. Wise statesmen that they were. They knew the tendency of liberty to beget prosperity, and prosperity to breed tyranny. And so they enshrined those immortal words in a public document, so that when in the future, if some man or some faction or some interest would set up their doctrine that none but this class or none but that class was entitled to those same unalienable rights, my friends, their posterity, you and I, could look up once again to the Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew the battle that our fathers began. So that truth, justice, mercy, all of the humane and Christian virtues would never be extinguished from this land, so that no man would hereafter dare to limit or circumscribe the great principle upon which liberty rests. So you see, my friends, the question of the hour truly is, cannot this country be reunited on that same basis? If it can, my friends, I will be one of the happiest men alive if I can help to so do. And if it cannot, it would be awful. If this government cannot be restored without giving up that principle, I was about to say, I would rather be assassinated on this very spot than ever to surrender that. Well, I do wish to provide you opportunity if you wish to tender questions. I'm loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Surely the mystic cords of memory, stretching over every battlefield and every patriot grave, to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of union when touched. As surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. And so, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish this work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just, a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Well, I suppose that concludes my remarks. But as I said, if any of you wish to tender any sort of question, I'll do my best to give it a ready answer, if I might. And now, if you are hesitant to tender the first question, I'll certainly take the second one first. Oh, this is wonderful. I wish I could get such a response from Congress. Well, being as that is the case, let me introduce my real self. Just break character here. And first, my name is Fritz Klein, and what I just concluded was actually all Abraham Lincoln's words, somewhat paraphrased. The preponderance of them was taken from his later words starting in about December of 1864, right up through his death, April 15th, 1865. You heard just about all of his second inaugural address. There were a couple little portions from 1861, a couple things, that we are not enemies but friends. That actually came from his first inaugural. And the part about being assassinated on the spot, he said that when he was in Philadelphia. But the rest of it came from like his last annual message to Congress in December 64 and so on. So, but commemorating the funeral of Abraham Lincoln posed something of a problem to us, other than, putting together a lot of mourning cloth and things like that. And we really wanted to present the legacy of Lincoln, what he not only hoped for in the future, but the basis for his hope, which was that simple statement about equality. It's more than just having the right ratios of race and sex and ethnicity in the workplace and being deferential to minority groups. It's so much more than that. Lincoln said we should sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars. He talked about that sentiment as the thing which gave liberty. Now, how does that operate? And it's really simple. in the workplace. We can have all the right quotas and ratios and wage equity and all of that. But there will still be people who will be shunned for other reasons, or maybe those very reasons. And maybe they eat alone in the lunchroom. And, all of that fine political talk simply means treating other people the way you'd like to be treated, as Lincoln himself in these words equated the two. Go sit with them for a change. Make a friend of the one that nobody befriends at the place of work. And you know what you will just have done? Given them a new liberty. They may actually begin to unfold before your very eyes, a person you've never known before, and before others as well, by simple acts of kindness. And that's really the basis of liberty. And Lincoln held that commitment all through his life, both in his political and his personal life. He practiced what he preached because he knew it worked. And he sought to perfect it. Yeah, he sometimes had temper. He wasn't a perfect person. But you can see it in his dealings with difficult people. I find it personally challenging, and I hope you did. So, anybody else who wishes to ask a question? We do thank you for coming. We know that parking was a bit of a difficulty today, and there's lots going on in Chicago, so we've always had smaller audiences in big cities, but especially today with a lovely day to be out and the parade and everything else going on, we treasure every last one of you who did choose to come. So we'll be available for questions if anybody wants to ask something in private, or if you want to do pictures, but at this point we're going to make a formal ending to the program. And oh, look, I got a question. Of all things, go ahead. Could Abraham Lincoln have ever conceived of a black man becoming president? Yes. In fact, he said many times, every race, religion, and color should have the same opportunity. Now, this is something that Lincoln made very clear, for an equal start. He distinguished that from an equal end. He believed in what we would call a meritorious democracy, that based on merit, everyone should be free to ascend as high as they can, go as far as they can, which is a little different than a guaranteed outcome. And so he included, every race, creed, color, and sex. And he specified those things. So, but then he also was very careful in his choosing of political friends. He tried to be very broad and discriminating at the same time, but it had nothing to do with externals. So I think when he looked at a possible candidate, if there had been candidates of differing sexes and colors and races, etc., he would have first looked at their politics and how it affected what he viewed to be the key issue of the day. There were many other issues in his time that political parties had even formed over. Immigration was one. Temperance, drunkenness, public, behaviors, all sorts of things. But he saw the issue of slavery as so fundamental that he focused everything on it. So, it's a complicated question, as simple as you presented it. But he wanted equal opportunity. But so I think he would have been pleased in many ways to seeing that unfold before us today. Yes, over here. Yes, yes. Yes, yes. Well, his question, if you didn't hear, was the mention of Indian affairs, and things were going so negatively in that respect. Discrimination against Indian peoples was even greater level than Lincoln was dealing with the black race. And so there were any number of horrific things that had happened during the course of the war, which brought it to his attention. And but he was a very practical man. And I think one of the issues that was presented to him during the Minnesota Indian Uprising in the summer of '62 was that it was almost impossible to deal with Indian issues because at this juncture in our history, there was no such thing as a reservation. Now, we would look at reservations with a rather negative, like they were sort of corralled into prison camps or something. But the ones that were working with the Indians presented it to Lincoln on these terms. What they would say, and there were several, some of them were actual Indians who said this, we can't have justice between the white and the Indian. It wasn't always white people, but between the different races, because as soon as they step onto Indian land, they're out of our reach. Our laws do not apply on Indian land. Now, if the Indians somehow came under the jurisdiction of the United States government, then those scallywags getting onto Indian lands and cheating them could be prosecuted. See? And now, it wasn't only outsiders who were scallywags. Another issue, now that I think would have been the first thing he would have addressed. But you also had Indians who were, you had division amongst the Indians. In Minnesota, they had what they called blanket Indians who stayed with their original culture. And then you had what they called the farmer Indians who were moving more towards the future and farming and doing things that their hunting, gathering heritage had not included. These two were at odds. And so you had cultural differences, and later generations tried to address those things. So I think he would have taken a legal basis first and then done similarly to what he did with the questions about black and white on the cultural level. So it's a very complicated problem. And in some segments of our country, you have both extremes today. Indian populations that are acculturated, they're still proud of their heritage, but you'll find them in IT work, HR work, every facet of modern society, and they still go to powwows. And then you'll find others who go to powwows, but they do not do any of the things that are involved in modern society. They disdain to do it. And so those same extremes are still with us. It's very fascinating stuff. I'd love to see how Lincoln would have dealt with it. That's just a guess on my part. So, yes, right here. Hi. How did he feel about the assassination, the possibility of the... Oh, yeah. Yeah, do I think he had any feelings about the possibility of assassination? Is that a fair estimate of your question? He did. He had to deal with it even before he left Illinois to go to Washington. And he stated, at least on one occasion, that it was something, facing death was something he was only going to have to do once in his life. He didn't want to have to deal with it every day. So he actually was a fairly courageous fellow. And there were those who knew him well once he got to Washington, some by job, some were family members, who feared for his safety. Mrs. Lincoln, for instance, insisted that he take a walking stick every evening he liked before he went to bed to go over to the War Office and see what the news of the day, the final news of the day was. And in those days, there was a concrete walk along some trees and flower beds between the White House and the War Office at night. And it was lit by gas, but in some places rather dimly. And there was one area where there was a wall that anybody could have hid behind. So he tended to go with somebody later in the war because Mrs. Lincoln insisted, and she also wanted him to carry a cane, so in case somebody jumped over the wall to, do him in, he could give him what for. But he really did not like it. Another issue was Mr. Stanton would insist that he have a guard when he drove out to where he stayed in the summer, about 7 miles away from the White House. And he hated all the clattering of soldiers and the pomp and circumstance that it brought to what he viewed was a fairly humble role as president. So, he really viewed himself as a public servant. And when it got hot and sultry and there were plagues in Washington sometimes, cholera and other things took place, others would head for the hills, literally. They'd go to the Poconos or up to the Adirondacks. His cabinet members, sometimes he was almost the only one that stayed and worked in the White House. Hardly ever took holidays. If he did, it was a working holiday. He'd go down and talk to the military, ride horses for fun, out on his way to see the troops. Yeah. Well, what would he think of the office of the president now? Lincoln, with all of the extreme situations he found himself in the middle of war, for instance, emancipating slaves. It was a huge constitutional question, and others. He was very reflective, meaning constantly considering what the Constitution allowed and didn't. Because he was a lawyer, and he knew anything that he might have attempted to do in time of war would eventually be tried in courts. And he knew how that worked. And so he would view, and he did view the Constitution as flexible, but he also was very careful to look at the original intent. So it was flexible in times of an emergency, as the authors intended it to be, but then he, believe it or not, as much as he's accused of initiating big government, as we call it today, he basically believed that the executive should have a fairly minor role, that Congress should have the larger role. He did not believe in judicial review, meaning that the Supreme Court had the final say over whether something was constitutional, and Jefferson didn't either. And Lincoln quoted Jefferson on that matter right in front of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during his inaugural speech. So he had a lot of audacity to do that. But nonetheless, he would look at the presidency today within the framework of the Constitution. And it has changed over the years. And he would probably, as a lawyer, look at the circumstances and some of the amendments since the 13th that have taken place. I think he'd have some things to say. So, anybody else? Oh, you've been great. Oh, yeah, I hardly saw your hand up there. Got to move in order for me to notice. Yes, sir. Oh, yes. I know how that feels. Thank you. His question was, his desire to memorize, and how do I do it? And what I do when I have a long, and I have had as long as a nearly 3-hour play, in which I had the preponderance of the role, and it took me many months, about 6 months, to master it. This particular program, a 30-minute speech will take me some weeks to get in its roughest form. And so there are stages in it, and never be discouraged. You do memorize every day. You memorize people's appearance. You memorize how to get to here from there in your normal circuit of, and it's amazing. I surprise myself. So I start small, and I refresh myself, and then once I know that I can pretty much say that at the drop of a hat, I'll add another small portion onto its tail, and then another one, and I learn them in sequence, and I always carry the whole thing with me, and I get maybe the first page might take me a week, and it only takes you to go through a typical page about anywhere from, depending on font size, from 2.5 to 5 minutes per page, but that'll take me a week. But if I can get through that in a week, so that I can, and I like to walk when I memorize, so I'll combine exercise with memorizing, and I walk around learning it, and I'll say it until I get stuck, and then I'll refresh myself. And whenever there's a sticking spot, I come up with what they call a memory device. And I'll think of something, maybe it ends with catastrophe, and then I'll think of something that has the word cat in it. Skin a cat, cat scan, or catafalque, anything, and I'll get a picture of a kitty cat or whatever I need, and maybe the next phrase I'm jumping from this ship to the next ship, so to speak, has another phrase in it, and maybe that has she. The word she starts maybe the next sentence, and I'll think cat, mouse, cheese. So I get this little picture that fits together, and then catastrophe, she, cat, cheese, forget about the mouse. And that only lasts for a while, and then I don't use that device anymore. So it's an amazing process, but stick with it. You'll be surprised. Yeah, I'm 66. I'm still learning all kinds of stuff. Learn more about my background? Well, my field was landscaping. I lived in Hawaii, of all places, but I played around with acting. I had no intentions of getting anywhere in it because my mother had been involved with Hollywood people. I grew up in Southern California, and she always warned us about how bad it was. So, I played around with it a little bit. But then in 1976, a director asked me if I would take the Lincoln role, and I actually refused it. But I was the skinniest guy around, and I had a beard already, and all I needed to do was trim it down. And so he kind of insisted, and I eventually took it, and it took me 4 hours of professional makeup to look old then. Now I'm 66, it doesn't take any time at all. I even act old now. So, yeah, and so that's what happened. Within four years, it had become full-time. I started getting requests to do it again and again and to develop new things. And so I've had to become something of a Lincoln scholar. And I love it. It's such fun and such a privilege, really. So, anybody else? Yep, yeah, my friend. Had a chance to visit it. I actually live in Springfield. So I'm headed home. That's our next and last stop. And I get to work in there. Oh, I have such fun because, we've in that museum, if you haven't been there, you got to go. There's two basic vistas. One is the log cabin growing up years, and the other is the White House war years. So when I'm there, often they'll get me positioned in the White House, and in one room, it's the kitchen, the White House kitchen, and I'll sit at a table, and I bring my own food and coffee, and there's a wooden counter, and I'll sit there maybe like this, quite still, and I get some junior high kids come in, then I put my hand down and I take a sip of coffee. Oh, I have had such fun, Now, if I get some older folks, I can tell by their voices about the age group that's coming in. If I get some folks that, I don't want to give someone a heart attack, but it's adult vengeance on junior high, you know how that works. So anyway, the older ones, I'll try to stay moving. And even some of them go when they come through, So it's fun. Because they have these latex figures. They look wax, but they're very lifelike, and each one costs like $1 million. So all through there, and here I am, a real person. So, yeah, there are perks in every job. Anybody else? Way in the back, did you have a, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Great question. His question was, I had stated, and a great memory too, that there were many other issues surrounding Lincoln's era at the beginning, and he focused on slavery as the core issue. Now, if he hadn't been assassinated, the question was, you let me know if I'm not stating this right, would he have then attended to some of those other issues? I think some yes and some no. For instance, the issue of immigration. In some ways, that's related to the issue with black people and certain racial groups such as Indians. Now, some of them weren't so obvious in their outer appearance. Certain European groups, they all look alike to some folks, And so, but for instance, the Irish were discriminated against a lot. And so I think Lincoln may well have addressed the immigration issue. Because sometimes immigrants would come in, and there was a lot of corruption in that department too. In some parts of the country, like New York City, they had something called Tammany Hall, and they would tell them, you vote for us, and there's something in it for you. And they weren't making their own decisions. They were just doing it, because it seemed like the best thing to do economically or something. So that might have been something he'd get involved in if he had time. If he lived to be a ripe old age. Others of those issues had to do with temperance. That was a huge issue. And temperance means basically self-control, but it was referring to excessive drinking. And some of Lincoln's former associates were advocates. They themselves didn't drink. And there's a lot of public drunkenness in those days, and a lot of families that were in hard times because of it, almost like a gambling addiction. And I don't think he would have addressed that particular one. So now that's just my opinion. You know, life doesn't have enough time in it to address all of the ills in the world. But I think he would have picked the ones that he saw as very foundational to what our country stood for. So, and he really believed treating people as you wish to be treated was the core of liberty. He did one time address the question of drunkenness, and the interesting thing he said was that, because he had gone to temperance meetings, and he said, if you get somebody in there who had never had to struggle with alcoholism, and they start denouncing the people that are attending, he says, you'll never get an audience. Those people will never listen. But he said, but when you get somebody come up to one of those meetings who used to be an alcoholic and was now free, he said, they relate. And that's something that he did all through his life. When people would say, oh, those people, they were AWOL, they fled their duty, they ought to be jailed and shot. You know, this is a time of struggle in our country. One of Lincoln's secretaries said something like that one time. He was very upset at soldiers who had run away from their post. You know what Lincoln did? The same thing that those temperance people did. He tried to form a link. And he said, you know, I think I might have done the same thing if I found bullets whizzing around my head. And so that's one of the keys that Lincoln practiced in his life, and that was identifying with the weaknesses of other people. So it's hard to say. Well, right there again. Well, any parting things that I've learned that I thought were phenomenal, that last thing is something that I have tried to take into my life. Because it's human nature. And Lincoln even said things like this. When we see someone who's vastly different, or maybe they're caught in a snare that we don't have to deal with, it's just human nature to go, oh, can you believe the way they dress? Or can you believe something, you know, I would never, or how could they? And I find myself making statements like that, sometimes just in my brain. And so I stop myself and I think, you know, they're just like me. They look different. They carry different baggage, but I got baggage too. And it's really prompted me to start being more understanding of people, no matter how different they seem. Well, listen, you guys have been here a long time, so we're going to let you go now. And if you want to come up and do a picture or another question privately, we'll do that. But we do treasure every last one of you. Thank you for coming.